So we have heard about budgets being rejected and all of that. And some of our Facebook people and some of our fans have written to us and say that they have been told that there's a history in this in this country. There's a history of a budget being rejected. It's a very long time ago. It's 1980. In this video, we're going to tell you the story, just the story about everything that happened. We're delighted that it has been written in a book by the man, the protagonist, the man who was finance minister, whose budget was rejected. It's in this book, My Time, My Nation, autobiography of Professor George Bennett. Sadly, he passed not too long ago. Professor Bennett died, and people of my generation and a bit younger would remember Professor George Bennett as the Vice Chancellor of the University of Ghana, two-time Vice Chancellor of the University of Ghana, Professor of Geography, a politician, etc. Of course, people also remember that in 1996, before Professor Mills became Vice President of Rawlings, Professor Bennett was touted as the one who was going to be the Vice President. Then he was still in politics. But this is Professor Bennett in 1980, writing about... Professor Bennett now writing about something that happened in 1980. My Time, My Nation. So let me give you a bit of a background. Professor Bennett became the Minister of Finance in the Third Republic, which election was conducted in 1979 and was won by the PNP, the Nkrumah's party of Dr. Liman. Now, in that constitution, ministers were not members of parliament, something that people are clamoring for an amendment for this constitution. Every minister was not a member of parliament. If you were a minister, you cannot be a member of parliament. If you're a member of parliament and you were made a minister, you resign your seat and then there's a by-election. Very similar to the American situation. They wanted a strict separation of powers. So people like Professor Bennett, who were ministers, were not members of parliament. They couldn't have been members of parliament at the time. This is how the constitution was. Let me show you the results of the parliamentary elections in 1979, which brought in the Third Republic, so that you can understand as we roll out the story of this, the history of this first budget that was rejected. So this was the parliamentary distribution in the 140-member Parliament of Ghana in the Third Republic. Political party representation in 1979. So Dr. Liman, who was the president and the presidential candidate of the People's National Party, he was the main man over there. They had 71 seats. And then one of my favorite politicians that I never met, just read about him, Victor Owusu of the Popular Front Party. He had 42 seats. The Popular Front Party, the closest challengers of the PNP, had 42 seats. Now, this was an MPP type party. The winners were an Nkrumah's type party. So 42 seats for them. The next one, the United National Convention, which was also an MPP type of party, had 13 seats in parliament. It was led by William Oforiatta. Mind you, Dr. Liman, Victor Owusu, and William Oforiatta were not members of parliament, but they were the leaders of the party. So William Oforiatta's party got 13 seats. This is one of my favorite old-time politicians. I met him once in London a long time ago before he died. Colonel Banasco, who was a famous minister of agriculture under the Champon regime. He formed a political party, Action Congress Party. They got 10 seats. Okay. Then the Social Democratic Front was led by Mr. Ibrahim Mahama. He got 3 seats. And then there was one independent candidate. The total was 140 seats. Keep your eye on the 71. That was the majority, the majority members. They had 71 seats. Let's move on. So let's put all the minority members together, see what we got. 42 plus 13 plus 10 plus 3 plus 1 gives us 69 seats. And let's come back to this. The majority has 71 seats. So the majority had enough majority to conduct their business. They had 71 seats, all the opposition put together, and they were never sometimes going to be together. Had 69 seats. You got to keep an eye on that. Okay, let me introduce you to the leaders. Mr. C.C. Fiti. He was the PNP leader. He is from West Dai constituency. There is his photograph. He was the majority leader of the day. A nice man over there, Mr. C.C. Fiti, or if you like, Honorable C.C. Fiti, PNP member for West Dai. And then the minority leader was Honorable Kweku Bam from the Popular Front Party. He was a member of parliament for Nkoko. Of course, Kweku Bam, who died recently, was later to live to become a member of the National Democratic Congress. Here in 1979, he was a member of the MPP type party, the Popular Front Party of Victor Owusu. But later on in his politics, he became a member of the NDC. Okay, so this was the kind of arrangement that obtained as Professor Bennett took his budget to Parliament. Next, we're going to show you what Professor Bennett wrote about the entire story about his budget. Sit back, watch carefully, get a cup of tea. If it's in the morning, if it's in the afternoon, get something, and just follow me carefully. This is a golden part of Ghana's history that has to do with budget rejection. Professor Bennett tells his own very, very painful story. Now, here it is. Okay. It says that major experience with regard to public policy formulation was the 1980 budget. He says, this was a major assignment that I had to undertake as a non-economist, but I also had some clear ideas as to how the budget should be prepared. Although they defied me, on my return, that he said his staff defied him. On my return, we had to prepare the budget, a difficult process without the cooperation that I required. People were late in submitting their drafts to me, but I had some clear ideas, such as giving incentives to investors who wanted to invest outside Accra after chatting with friends and picking their brains. Okay, so he says after chatting with friends and picking their brains, he wanted to give incentives to those who wanted to invest outside Accra. Another clear idea was to reduce the tax burden of workers and reducing some taxes. Later on, I discovered that one of the reasons why the civil servants in my ministry were not cooperating fully with me was because of their suspicion that some people outside the ministry were giving me ideas for the budget. This, of course, was not true. To my greatest surprise, the deputy minister, who was an economist and whom I could depend on, had decided not to contribute anything at all. Now, this was a very difficult time in Ghana. And you know, when you read this happened in 1980. Look at how many years ago. Much of what happens with the human behavior doesn't really change with time. Well, Professor Bennett is writing, somebody can write it today. He said the civil servants didn't want to cooperate because they thought he was getting ideas from somewhere else. Okay, let's move on. He says, in spite of this setback, we were able to complete a draft budget that I took to cabinet for discussion. When the cabinet meeting was scheduled to take place, there were not enough copies to go around because of the lack of cooperation from my subordinates. Cabinet was attended by some of the PNP officials, and after lengthy discussion, the main proposals were accepted. I had literally sat behind my desk from morning till evening before I went to the cabinet meeting. The idea was that when one chapter was approved, it should quickly go to the government printers to print, to ensure that by the time Parliament met, there would be sufficient copies for each member. When the cabinet meeting closed at 10 p.m. and I went to the ministry, printing was so slow, I decided to go to the government printers to find out exactly what was happening. I sat with them for some time, giving them encouragement, but left the printing house at about 4 a.m. because I realized that I had not in fact written my opening statement. I came back to the ministry to find that there was no draft on my table. This was a minister who was having a very, very difficult time with the staff. 1980. Let's move on. I had to sit down and write a long opening statement, which I was going to deliver in Parliament. The PNP MP leading the House, Honorable Fiti, was so worried that there would be not sufficient copies when Parliament assembled. A message was sent to me to find out whether the budget debate should be postponed, but he, Fiti, I'm sure, advised that it will be terrible. I said we should go ahead. At about 6:30 a.m. in the morning, I drafted my opening statement. My secretary had typed it. I decided to go home and change and got home to find that my wife was not around and my bedroom had been locked. In fact, I was dressed in that night a white flowing gown. Okay, it says, in fact, what I was dressed in that night, a white flowing gown, was what I wore to Parliament that day. Now, when you listen to this story, what's the fundamental change that you see has happened? The mobile phone. The mobile phone would have completely changed this story, wouldn't it? Thank God for the mobile phone. I always talk about the mobile phone. Look at the story in 1980. Professor Bennett says that as Minister of Finance, listen, he says that he had been following the printing of the budget, and we are telling you the historical story, golden story in the annals of Ghana's history of Parliament. Now, he had been doing the budget thing, and at 6:30 a.m., he had been up since 10 p.m., 4 a.m., 6:30 a.m. He goes to his office. He's going to Parliament at 9 o'clock. He finds that he has not actually written his opening statement. So he's putting the opening statement together. He goes home to go and change and go to Parliament without any sleep. His wife has locked the bedroom. She's gone to work. And he couldn't call her. No mobile phone. He just couldn't do anything. Thank God for the mobile phone. Let's move on as we get into more history. Although I was tired, he says, I was able to deliver my budget statement amid the applause and the relief of the PNP members who thought I could not do it because of the sequence of events. After the address, when I stepped out amid the applause, the United States ambassador shook my hand and congratulated me because he knew the circumstances and thought I had done a good job. I was so pleased with that encouragement. None of my own MPs followed me out, but one or two members of the opposition, including Mr. J. Kofor, came out and said, well done. I thanked him and drove home, this time to go and rest because I was tired. So you see the name that pops up there. Mr. J. Kufuor was a member of parliament of the opposition. When Bennett read the budget statement, his own party, he claims, did not follow him, the PNP. Mr. J. Kufuor from the opposition followed him and shook his hand, said, "You have done well." Kufuor has been a nice man for a very, very long time. Very, 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 very long time. Okay. The next day, I was told that I had to go to parliament to defend part of the budget before the Finance Select Committee for them to authorize temporary release of funds for the government. This was a difficult assignment for me because I was sure that the economists on that committee will take advantage of me, knowing that I did not have a background in economics. I negotiated with the PNP leader in the House for the committee to agree that I could be accompanied to the committee meeting by my deputy, an economist. When the time came, I drove to Parliament's house. But when I arrived, my deputy was nowhere to be found. The committee delayed a little bit, hoping that he would arrive. But when there was no sign of him, they decided to go ahead. I went in and I was asked one or two technical questions. And of course, since I was prepared and had taken part in the actual preparation of the budget, the arguments were all clear and I was able to answer all their difficult questions. At the end of the budget presentation, the chairman congratulated me and that was the end of it. I was a bit unhappy about this, since the budget had not been debated by Parliament, and indeed I asked the President whether it would be necessary for me to be present when the budget was being debated. Now here, Professor Bennett is talking about something that happened. The President of Ghana, Dr. Liman, called him and asked him to travel abroad with one other person, and that's what he says he was unhappy about. Okay, he goes on. So Professor Bennett and Nabila were in America. The President sent them to go and meet with the IMF. Now he continues. We had a series of meetings with the IMF officials, and towards the end, one of the officials called me aside and asked whether I had heard anything about my budget. I responded I had not. When we flew to London on our way to Ghana, we met the embassy officials who told us that there was a problem in Ghana and that the budget had been rejected. So you need to understand the story. Professor Bennett presents the budget to Parliament. He goes to the committee to answer the question. Whilst the debate is going on, as it goes on today, President says, travel abroad, go and have meetings with the IMF on my behalf. He goes to America. One of the Americans in the meeting, after they calls him and says, have you heard anything about your budget? He says, no. Because obviously the American person knew what had happened. Then he gets to London, flying from America to London on their way to Ghana. The Ghanaian officials at the embassy tell them that your budget back in Ghana has been rejected. Now let's see how he deals with it. Okay. It was a shock because the PNP had a majority in Parliament. So I wondered how the budget could have been rejected. I decided that we should take the first flight from London to Accra to monitor what was happening. Professor Nabila tried to console me that the PNP leadership in Parliament will be able to work everything. He promised to talk to the President and see if my wife could come and join me in London for a few days. I was just determined to come back to Ghana, so I insisted that I should be booked on the first flight available. When we arrived at Kotoka International Airport, to my surprise, there were no pressmen at the airport to ask any questions. In fact, there were very few people who had come to meet me. Those there included one of my deputies, the late Mr. Katriku, who pulled me aside and asked me to be calm because this was a deliberate sabotage and he would give me the details later. I was so hurt, but I thanked him. Later on, he told me that a day before the vote, somebody told him that there was a plot to reject the budget, and one of the major architects was a PNP member who was chairman of the Parliamentary Subcommittee for Finance, an accountant whose only ambition was to be a Minister of Finance. And in fact, the person told him that the President was aware of the plot. I decided to deal with it myself. At our first cabinet meeting at Peduase Lodge, I told the meeting that I had information that members of the PNP were involved in the plots to reject the budget with some of my cabinet colleagues. I posed a question asking how we could work as a team when some of us were subverting colleagues. The President very diplomatically said I should not believe it. Okay, we move on. I told the cabinet that one of my deputy ministers in my ministry had told me about the plot. I had no reason to doubt his story and was very hurt. Later on, I was called by the President to the castle, who informed me that he had set up a cabinet subcommittee to revise the budget. for subsequent approval by Parliament and wanted me to cooperate with the committee. Now, hear Professor Bennett on this one. So the story is that his budget has been rejected. He's a furious and angry man. He comes to hear that his own colleagues, including the parliamentary subcommittee chairman, who should be working with him, as part of those who occasioned the rejection of the budget by Parliament. He's already wondering that how can we have 71, the total minority have 69, and then we lose a vote. He was wondering about that. We're going to get into all that, but there's very little left so that you can understand. Don't lose this bit of the history. So Professor Bennett is now told by the President Liman that he is setting up a subcommittee to revise the budget so that it goes back to Parliament. Here is his response. He says, I told him, referring to the President, that with all due respect, I would have nothing to do with the budget again. So the subcommittee could go ahead and do the revision. But if there was a great departure from the main proposal that I submitted, I would resign. Wow. The president disagreed with me, but I told him I did not understand how a budget we had all approved could be rejected by a party with a majority in Parliament. That's interesting. Okay, let's move on. I left the president, went home, and the following day went to Brekum, because I did not want to have anything to do with the revision of the budget. I was in Brekum for a few days and then started my journey back home to Accra. In Kumasi, I stopped at the regional administration to greet the regional minister. I met some of the PNP chief supporters there, Alhaji Tanko and some others. When I was going back to my car, Alhaji Tanko told me that there was going to be a major demonstration on the streets of Kumasi in support of the budget the next day. He urged me to stay and watch, but I told him I had to go back to Accra. The next day at the office, I asked my secretary to bring me all the newspapers. I scanned through them, but there was nothing about the demonstration in the newspapers or on the local news the whole day. I sent my public relations officer to the Ghana News Agency because they normally publish news briefs to find out whether the demonstration had been mentioned. Again, there was no mention of it. I thought the demonstration had not come on at all. But a few days later, Alhaji Tanko was in Accra and came to see me. He told me that the demonstration had been a massive success and expressed regret that I had not been there. The political system was such that news could even be managed sometimes. Professor Bennett is revealing a lot. This is 1980s, not today. It sounds like it's today, but as I'm saying, human behavior does not really change over time, you know, especially the destructible human behavior, the bad side. It doesn't change over time. This is what they did to him. There was a demonstration organized in Kumasi in favor of his budget. It didn't show up in the news. Nobody covered it. End of story. Okay, you have to understand that time there was just... it was democracy. There was private media, but there was no private electronic media, no private radio, no private television. Private was print, but they didn't print it. Okay, go on. The government could sometimes decide to kill a particular story if they so desired. I was so hurt, and it was so obvious that the letdown of the MPs on my own side of Parliament that I was quite aloof for some time. That is not the complete story. So what's the complete story? Let's hear it. There was a die-hard CPP man, Mr. Buduakwa, a former patron of Cape Coast Ebusuan Dwarfs, a football club, who felt so angry about the plot that he decided to call a press conference and expose all those behind the plot at the Avenida Hotel. He sent word to me and gave me a copy of his press statement. I was later told that the press conference was well attended, but not a word of what he said appeared in the papers. One evening, when I arrived at my official residence, there were many cars parked in the yard. Okay, before I go to the many cars parked in the yard, what does this tell you about how different that time is from this time? Facebook. We talked about the mobile phone, Facebook. So if the press conference was covered and the media were paid or something not to publish it, Facebook Live would have done it. So we live in a better era, isn't it? We live in an era where you cannot suppress information. Information is free. Information is going out. Information is blowing out. Nobody, no political authority, no military, no gun, no armored car can suppress information because on Facebook, you remember the Arab Spring? Egypt blocked everything, Tunisia blocked everything, Algeria blocked everything. They decided to text people in Facebook and say, come to Tahrir Square, and it was a mammoth demonstration, what we now call the Arab Spring. So this generation, we ought to be grateful for Facebook. Professor Bennett's story would not have been possible if there was Facebook. It would not have been as painful as it is if there was Facebook. Okay, so let's see the surprise. He says, I was later told that the press conference was well attended, but not a word of that was heard. Okay, read that. One evening, now here's the surprise. When I arrived at my official residence, there were many cars parked in the yard. And as I wondered what was happening, my houseboy rushed to inform me that I had visitors. Okay. I went straight to the sitting room, and to my surprise, I saw the president. Dr. Liman, it will be. The Vice President, Mr. DeGraff Johnson, it will be. And my colleague cabinet ministers all sitting there. 10 minutes later, a lot of food was brought in. The president apologized for the lack of ceremony, but joked that they had decided to have dinner with me. We all laughed and had a pleasant dinner, and that was the end of it. However, the lesson I learned was that the politics in this country could be really dirty. That's what Professor Bennett said. Has that changed? You should answer that question, young man, young woman, watch it. Has that changed? He said, this is 1980, by the way. The lesson I learned was that the politics in this country could be really dirty. Okay. I was told the main reason why the budget was rejected was the budget deficits. The revised budget reduced the deficit by a meager few hundred million cedis for approval. Clearly, there were other reasons why the budget was rejected. And indeed, I remember, now watch out for this name, watch out for this part of the story. He said, indeed, I remember when I met Dr. Jones Oforiatta from the opposition side and told him, quote, "You, my old friend, look at what you have done to me." He, Jones Oforiatta, said it was not the fault of the opposition. Who is Jones Oforiatta? Jones Oforiatta is the father of Ken Oforiatta. So you see the mix. This is Jones Oforiatta, who apparently had led, or it was told to Professor Bennett that he had led the budget rejection because he was a member of the opposition. He was a PFP member of parliament for Fantiakwa in the Eastern region, Dr. Jones Oforiatta. But he was a lecturer in the University of Ghana, so he must have known Professor Bennett from there. So Professor Bennett told him, "You, my old friend, look at what you've done to me." And Jones said to him, he said it was not the fault of the opposition. So I believed what I had been told by my deputy minister earlier, that there was a plot by my own party to disgrace me. Years later, Professor Adai Mensah, a former vice chancellor of the University of Ghana and a former general secretary of the PNP, in his comments on a paper delivered by Professor Michael Quay on the topic, the hybrid constitution and its attendant difficulties, at a debate organized by the IEA to make an input into the ongoing constitutional review, offered a further explanation as to why the budget was rejected. He, Adai Mensah, said the MPs felt peeved because colleagues who had contested elections and lost were being offered better recognition than the MPs. He explained that the MPs saw the reading of the budget as payback time and therefore decided to leave the chamber of parliament for the minority to have enough numbers to reject it. So you see what happened. This is what happened. There were 71. The minority was 69. But because the MPs on the government side were angry, they decided to leave the chamber. So the minority will have the numbers. So some people left the chamber. They didn't participate in the vote. After the speaker put the question, they slipped away because they wanted Professor Bennett's budget to fail. So that's the lesson. That's the big lesson. That's the story. That's a historical story. Nothing much to add. See you on Good Evening Ghana tomorrow night. I hope you enjoy the history. Thanks and have a good day.